They spoke to her faintly, in a language she didn't understand, the words giving her migraines that felt like dead fingers rooting around in her brain. The Forgotten Island by David Sodergren. Welcome to Books in the Freezer, a podcast dedicated to the deliciously disturbing world of horror fiction. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Devin, and today we're getting a little more feral, looking at the bestial side of horror when we discuss creature horror.
This episode of Books in the Freezer is brought to you by Audible. This podcast wouldn't be possible without audiobooks. So if you want some spooky stories told by some familiar voices, try Stephen King's Pet Sematary, read by Dexter's Michael C. Hall, or The Dead Zone, read by James Franco, or podcast favorite Joe Hill's Nosferatu, read by Kate Mulgrew. For a free audiobook and 30-day trial, go to audibletrial.com/booksinthefreezer. Happy listening.
Yeah, if you guys can't tell, I am getting over a cold, as I'm sure you can hear.
If this is you getting over the cold, I would hate to have listened to you during the cold. You sound like a creature. So it's very fitting for the episode.
Oh, like a nasal congestion creature. Very spooky.
Yeah.
So we've talked about doing creature horror before, and I know it's a subgenre that you really like, Devin.
Yes. I think I say this about a lot of subgenres. That's, I think, one of the core foundations of horror. Like, if you think about the biggest horror franchises, horror icons that you have werewolves, vampires, stuff like this, and all of them can be used in a creature setting. Most horror stories will fit within this genre, I would say.
Really? I guess I've just always thought of like werewolf and vampire as like very much their own genre, but I guess like technically they would be under the umbrella of creature.
Yeah, because before werewolf was just a popular term in and of itself, a werewolf was just a monstrous creature that would eviscerate people. Vampires were creatures that stalked the night and preyed upon vulnerable people. A creature is a very broad term that can encapsulate most of the genres of horror. This, I think, more than any other genre we covered, can have more overlap with other episodes that you and Rachel have done or you and I have done in terms of stories that will fit into this category that we use for others, like the ocean and underwater horror episode that you guys did.
Oh yeah, like Into the Drowning Deep.
Yeah, exactly like that.
So that means that one of my favorite horror books ever is technically a creature horror book.
Yeah, no, that's true. And like, again, with sea horror, and like the Loch Ness Monster, that's a creature. You can have a great horror story with that. Even as recent as our last episode with sci-fi horror, we talked about movies and such like Aliens and The Thing and stuff like this, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. All of these technically are creature stories. So all this stuff really goes back and harkens back to creature horror. So
that makes sense. Well, that leads to something I was going to ask you is like, is the term creature something we just use as kind of a catch-all for a non-human antagonist? So it's not necessarily an animal or like relating to an animal. Like it's not necessarily like a wolf or a dog or something like that. Like it can be, like you said, an alien. I
think the term itself has its own definition subjectively with the person that you're speaking to. But in general, I don't even think saying a non-human antagonist fits, because there are people who will count creature as human beings that are just feral in nature. It's a broad term that it's hard to really define, but
so like I was going to say, would The Thing from Jeepers Creepers be considered a creature?
I would consider Jeepers Creepers to be a creature horror story, because the creeper itself is this single menacing monster that's not recognizably human. The way it behaves, the way it operates, the way it exists, its lifespan, the way it feeds, the way it survives, all this stuff is completely different and unique to it itself and so different from human beings that definitely that would be a creature film.
So I've mentioned a few times creature horror is something I don't think I enjoy, but then like when I really start digging into things I like, I do enjoy parts of it. Sometimes I think I have a hard time getting into a story when it's people running away from like a monster, if that makes sense. Like it kind of takes me out of the realism of it. Also, I would say if like the way the monster is described to me is just like too crazy and I have a hard time even imagining it, I think takes me out of it a bit. But one thing that I noticed that I really did enjoy in the books that I'm recommending is the way that they're set up is that they're definitely horror. There is, especially when you don't know what the creature is until the end or you don't see it, there is so much dread that gets built up, like in the first 2/3 of the book.
You could take 3/4 of a book and never actually feature the creature at all.
Yeah.
And spend all that time building until that payoff in the end. What I think the strength of the creature horror, I guess, genre or subgenre is the versatility that it has. Because you have selected stories that are definitively horror. My selection are not so much. I'm going to give a bit of a spoiler, but I'm pretty sure I will say both my selections are room temperature. Because they're not, they are horror. They fit within the genre of horror, but they're more action-y than probably scary.
Okay.
But my approach to it was to show the versatility of creature horror, because both of mine essentially use the same kind of creature. But if you read both of the books, then you can see the dichotomy between how an author can take a single creature and tell the story different ways.
Oh, definitely. I have that within my picks too. There was books that I had read that did feature creatures. Wow.
Creature feature.
Yeah, that were creature features. But I felt like that aspect of it was a spoiler. Like it's not something that the book outright said. So it's something I wanted the reader to discover for themselves. So with my picks, I had to go with stuff that I think was more obviously a creature story. Was that an issue you had at all?
I didn't have that issue, but I know the kind of stories you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's a type of story where most of it is playing with the fear of the unknown that we talked about before. And it's just the payoff for that fear is the reveal of a creature behind it all along.
Yes.
One that does this, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say, is It. You spend most of the book of It thinking about Pennywise as this kind of entity that doesn't really have a true form or anything, but just this essence of evil that's tormenting these children. And when it comes down, when the kids confront them, you see that it has a physical form, it has an origin. Even It by Stephen King, even though it is one of these stories of creatures using your fears against you and playing with you psychologically, it still counts as a creature horror because of the entity itself that's causing it.
Speaking of It, did you see the new trailer drop today for part 2?
You mean like last week?
No, it dropped today.
Or did it drop on the 9th of May?
It dropped, sorry. Yeah, listeners, it dropped last week.
Yeah, it came out last Thursday.
Yeah. Came out on May 9th, which is today.
No, actually, I have not watched it yet. I didn't know it dropped. How is it?
It looks really good. They dropped in the scene where adult Beverly goes back to Derry and she goes back to visit like where she used to live, and it's like the old lady that invites her in. Do you remember the scene I'm talking about? Yes.
I do.
Oh my gosh. They did such a good job. Like, it's so creepy.
I will totally go watch that when we're done recording this.
So speaking of movies, let's talk about some movies that are technically creature horror.
Film is a very good medium for dabbling into creature horror. It's very visually stimulating. And again, as I said, when it comes to novels, a lot of the big horror movies that immediately come to mind when you think of horror, even if you're not a fan of horror, fall within the realm of creature horror. Top of the list would be Peter Benchley's Jaws. That's one of the first like horror movies people think of when they think of like mid-'80s big blockbuster horror movies.
Cujo,
yep. I talked about it in the sci-fi episode, but Critters, that was a staple of my childhood and an amazing horror movie for its humor and its horror.
We got a lot of crossovers from our sci-fi horror episode.
Pretty much, because that's where a lot of the sci-fi horror strength is, in these alien life forms that are, well, basically ripping us apart. But they qualify as creatures, like, as I already mentioned, Alien and The Thing, Predator. All these would be creature horror. And have you seen Cloverfield?
No.
Cloverfield is a kaiju movie, which means giant monster destroying city like Godzilla. However, it's a found footage movie, and the people that are trying to survive this giant creature destroying the city are navigating through like subways and city streets, and there's a bunch of these little creatures that fall off of the bigger creature. So it becomes a really fast-paced, intense creature horror film as well. And I will say one of the best horror movies that came out in 2015 across the board, It Follows.
I love It Follows. That's crazy because I would not even think to categorize it as a creature horror movie, but you're right.
You don't know what the creature looks like. That's true, but it is it is a physical creature that is constantly stalking its prey, always walking towards it, never stopping. It's not a ghost or an illusion, because when like other characters interact with it, they physically get hit by it. And I think that's where I got sold on this movie. Was it's midway through, the creature is going after the main character, and the other people around see it happening, see her hair come up.
Oh, so when they're at the beach. Yeah.
Exactly. They swing a chair, and the chair strikes something. So there is something physically there. It's invisible to everybody but the person it's stalking, but it is a tangible being occupying that space. So yeah, this is a very brutal creature, but it is also a creature.